Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Sarah Westwick.
I'm Sarah Brown.
And I'm Luke Shelton.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, so we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/TolkienExperience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you, so without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. So I'm very pleased today to introduce Jenny Dolfen. Jenny is a very talented illustrator from Germany who is well known for her art based on Tolkien and Star Wars. She has also won 3 Tolkien Society Awards for Best Artwork in 2014, 2018, and 2019. Jenny, thank you so much for being on the Tolkien Experience podcast.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So let's jump right into it. You are really well known in the Tolkien fandom for your artwork. So how were you actually introduced to Tolkien's work?
Yeah, it was really young. So I was about 6 when my mother read The Hobbit to me. My mother is a huge Tolkien fan and has been for a very long time. And she read The Hobbit to me when I was very little, primary school age. And when we were done, I asked, "Is it over? Isn't there more?" Because I'd probably seen a lot of books on her bookshelf that said Tolkien. And, she said, "Yes, there is more. We could start with that." And I said, "Oh, yes, please." So she started reading The Lord of the Rings to me. And she edited out a lot, I think, so left the lengthy descriptions probably, and maybe, I can't remember everything right now, but she probably shortened things to make it a bit more stringent and a bit more suited to the attention span of a 7-year-old. But yes, I was completely hooked, and I was absolutely in love with the story. And so that was my introduction to Tolkien.
That's really wonderful. So I'm curious, what is your favorite part of Tolkien's work itself? Because I know, for example, that a lot of the art you do is about the Silmarillion. So I'm curious, where did that come into your story, basically?
Yeah, it comes pretty late, actually, because my mother warned me against the Silmarillion. She had it on a bookshelf. She had this whole Tolkien bookshelf with the Carwyn Fondest Atlas and all sorts of secondary stuff. So she was really a digger as well as I am. And she had the Silmarillion in German, which was strange because everything else she owned about Tolkien was all in English. And I said, "Well, what about that one? That brown one that says Silmarillion, is it any good?" She said, "Oh no, it's very boring, and it's very stuffy, and you wouldn't like it." I believed her. So it took me a long time to get into that. And I had a role-playing friend in high school when I was 17, who kept bringing up stuff from Tolkien's lore that I'd never heard about. And I kept asking, where did you get this from? Because I considered myself the authority on Tolkien, having been into that for 10 years. And he said, "Oh, it's all in the Silmarillion." And I began to think maybe it is worth looking into after all. So I read it for the first time, and it was pretty hard going. But I remember this very distinct feeling of reading the book for the first time, which really was a chore, especially in German. It's even more stuffy in German than it could ever be in English, because most of the beauty of the language is lost. And what is left is this very heavy biblical prose. And I went through it once and had the feeling I have to start again right from the beginning, this time armed with paper and pencil, to note down everything that's important about the characters, especially the F ones, which I definitely couldn't really keep apart on the first read. And
all of the Finns.
all the Finns, yes. I had some of them down pretty early on. So Finrod was a very early favorite already. And Maedhros, of course, very early on as well. And with Maedhros came Fingon. So I had 2 of the Finns straight pretty early, but yeah, it was really difficult. And then I went through again and really did my homework and made genealogical tables of everybody, including the Feanorians, because they're not in the official genealogical table in the published Silmarillion. It's just says 7 sons, and I was never happy with that because you have to have all the sons and the 1 grandson. And when I was done with that, I bought it in English and read it cover to cover and never looked back. So that was really an eye-opener with the beautiful language in there. And that was a huge step towards studying English literature as well, and linguistics later.
That's wonderful. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, about your forays into English literature and linguistics?
Yeah. Tolkien really hit during a period in my life when I was considering myself very much an intellectual. And I really wanted to go on to university and learn all these wonderful things like Old English and Middle English. And I was very much into Latin at that time as well. So for my advanced courses, I had Latin and English. And I'm a digger as well. So I wanted to get into everything as deeply as I could. And that was a major incentive for me to take up studying English literature and linguistics as well as classical philology at university then.
That's really wonderful.
Even if I only became a teacher then, but I still make sure that I sprinkle a lot of linguistics into my Latin classes as well.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot that you can share with your students that way.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that very few people ever think about. Like, where does this word come from? Or absolutely fascinating things like we learn Latin. Why don't we learn the colors? Because Latin had very few words for colors, and they were not very important. Because the ancients thought about color in a very different way from the way that we do. And so there's a lot of things that I love really giving to my students. And I know that about half of the class takes it as a chance to just have a bit of a nap and wake up once it becomes exam relevant again. But there's a lot of people that really sit there and are completely fascinated by this completely whole new world that I'm letting them see a glimpse of. And they ask questions, and they really love it when I bring it up again and again and again, because there's always opportunities to bring up linguistics when you're teaching Latin as well as English. So it's really great.
Absolutely. Are there any particular, I guess, linguistic features or names in Tolkien's work that really jumped out to you or stood out to you, whether the first time you read the Silmarillion or later?
I think that Tolkien's obsession with linguistics, and linguistics being the starting point for his entire creation, is something that is so deeply ingrained in The Lord of the Rings that it's completely inseparable from the reading experience. And my mother is the same, so I had the whole package of story and characters and linguistics, which she was very interested in as well. And I can't really say when that started, because it was always there. And my mother is very much into linguistics, language change, cognates, so which words are related, saying something and in the middle of the sentence, hang on, where does that word come from? I want to know. And then running straight to the dictionary of etymology and looking it up. So that was completely normal in my family, and I like that.
That's great. That sounds like a wonderful environment to get introduced to Tolkien's work.
Absolutely. Yes, and I'm very fortunate to have had that, yes.
Oh, brilliant. So before we move on to the next question, I also just wanted to ask, because we're talking about favorite parts of Tolkien's work, I know that one of your favorite characters is Maithros, and I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sorry, I didn't get the question because
we're
really laughing.
No, that is totally fair. That is totally fair. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, why is he your favorite character? Why is he sort of an idée fixe in the art that you create?
He's always been one of the ones that really fascinates me. I'm very much into tragic characters and tragic stories. So some of the greatest stories that I loved growing up was always the tragic ones. So it was always Dietrich von Bern, so Theodoric, instead of Siegfried, the all-powerful figure of light. I was never so much into those. And when I got into Astrid Lindgren, for example, the Swedish author, it was always the sad stories that I loved much, like the Brothers Lionheart and Me, My Son. So these things were completely up my alley. And once I got into those really tragic characters in the Silmarillion, of which there are, as you know, a whole lot, Maithros takes the cake of tragedy. I suppose he doesn't, Turin does. But for some reason, I never got into Turin quite as much as I did into Maithros, because, he's only in the one chapter, and Maithros is just there from the beginning to the end, really. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Wonderful. So then...
And of course, he's visually interesting as well.
Oh, yes, true.
Yeah, because it took me a while because I was reading the history of Middle-earth as it came out. So I didn't have access to all of these wonderful tidbits of information. But one of the... I forget which one it was that for the first time told us that he had red hair. I think it's The Shaping of Middle-earth, I think it is. And when I read that and had to adjust my mental image of him, I really liked that because it added a bit of interest to the character and made me pick up color for the first time, which I'd never done before. So that was an excuse to break out the colored pencils.
That's great. So it has also influenced your journey as an artist then?
Absolutely, yes. These two have gone absolutely hand in hand. And there is I think the very first bit of Tolkien illustration I did was when I was 7. And it had Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. Legolas was my favorite character in the Lord of the Rings. So it was always elves for me. I'm very much an elf person. I couldn't help it. So it was Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli surrounded by the riders of Rohan. And even I was only 7, I arranged these riders in a circle around these 3. And I obviously couldn't be bothered to draw like 30 horses, but at least Eomer got a horse.
Oh, so. Lucky him.
Yeah. So the rider of Rohan. But there was these spears pointing inward and such. So it was really one of those very early pieces of art that was always very very typical for me. So I'd noticed that people were often bored with my obsessions, and of course, my obsessions were very often getting very obsessive. So as a child, I would never shut up about my favorite books. And I would never have any friends to talk to because my friends were never into the sort of literature that I was reading. So drawing these pictures gave me hours of immersing myself in the story once again. And showing it to my parents gave me 2 or 3 minutes during which I could talk about these things without being interrupted or having my eyes rolled at me or something. So, yeah.
That's great. So I guess that kind of leads quite nicely into the next question, which is, what is your fondest experience of Tolkien's work?
It always has to do with drawing as well. So I've always been a very visual person, particularly in regard to the characters, not so much to the landscape, strangely, because all these wonderful landscape descriptions never really made me see the landscapes the way it makes other artists see them. I'm somebody who has trouble visualizing things. So I guess that's strange for a visual artist, but when I read, I don't see things very clearly. I don't see the characters very clearly. I see very fuzzy faces. I see general shapes and angles, and if somebody is long and lean or short and stocky, that's things that I see. But I don't see any background at all. If background is described, if somebody is sitting on a tree trunk, the tree trunk appears, but it vanishes immediately where the person is not sitting. So it's really a very fuzzy thing, and to capture that has always been something that I really like to explore. Mm-hmm. So reading something and loving it has always been drawing it as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So I'm curious then whether we mentioned briefly about how Tolkien has contributed to your growth as an artist. I'd like to know now, has the way you approach Tolkien's work in general changed over time, whether as a reader or an artist or a fan or whatever domain?
Remarkably little, I would say. It's always been reading and visualizing or not, and then visualizing it again on paper and putting down what I was seeing or not seeing or forcing myself to see. And the films never changed anything about that. I was already 26 when they came out, so most of Middle-earth was completely, fully formed in my head by that time. I have to say that the films helped me visualize the surroundings. So whereas before the films appeared, I had no problem at all putting characters in white voids. After that became a bit more difficult because the films had such wonderful visuals of the landscapes and everything. So that was absolutely a game changer for me, and I tried to incorporate a bit of that in my art after that, but not so much before that, really. Mm-hmm, and of course, after the arrival of the internet, which pretty much coincided with the films for me, there was suddenly this huge group of people that also knew the stories and had read the Silmarillion and were loving the same characters that I did. So that definitely changed my experience with Tolkien, and having this great audience that was very interested in my view of the characters and shared that view to such a huge degree. That's something that I always find fascinating, that there is so little description on the characters. And when you depict a character in a certain way and everybody says, oh, I saw it exactly the same way. And I think that's just amazing about Tolkien's ability as a writer to put down so little and generate so much without really expressing it any more clearly. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. I guess it's the power of his language that somehow the essence of a character comes through so clearly.
It is. Yeah. And it's so condensed. You can tell, especially for the Silmarillion, that after reading all the history of Middle-earth with all these different versions, how much the story was on his mind for decades. And I think that shows in every single sentence. And he managed to condense it even more in all these decades without losing anything, even though he wasn't saying it anymore. And I think that's absolutely fascinating when you talk about these characters, especially characters with other fans.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yeah, like that's something I'm kind of curious about as well, because you were one of the first Tolkien artists that I was exposed to when I got on the internet and got involved in fandom. So yes. So I would definitely say that your artwork has for sure informed some of the ways that I've pictured characters when I read the Silmarillion.
Probably.
Yeah, probably, especially
I hear that a
myself. Yeah, really.
Yes, I do.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so I was curious about that. Like, in terms of your because you have quite a strong presence on the internet. Like, I believe you also used to have a DeviantArt. I don't know if you still do. But
No, I
you're
don't.
also
No.
not anymore, right? But you're on Instagram and Twitter and everything. How has that how has that sort of, I guess, changed the way that you interact with other fans, other artists, even, and your the whole visual culture around Tolkien's work?
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is that what I'm doing is something that I've come to see as something that Tolkien didn't really want for his work. So when I'm talking about talking to other Tolkien illustrators, I met Ted Naismith at several of these Tolkien conferences, and we talk quite a lot. And it's always the same sort of general idea for Tolkien illustration, that the aim for the official illustration is always to show the surroundings, show the wonderful scenery and landscapes, plants, flowers, forests, and mountains, and leave the characters mostly to the reader's imagination, which I can absolutely get behind, even as an illustrator. But it's really something that I've never seen that way, because most of the artwork in books that I loved since I was a child was always very very character driven, and it didn't really leave you any chance to imagine the characters in any other way than portrayed on the page. So I naturally took that as my approach to illustrating everything. And sometimes I feel bad about really prescribing so much about these characters, especially when people tell me that my visions of the characters have informed their own vision so much. And I always worry about that a bit, because it feels a bit prescriptive. But on the other hand, it's the way I tick, and it's the characters I love, and it's the emotions that I want to portray. And I can't do that by just giving body language. Of course, yes, I can in some cases, and it's even more evocative, but I don't want to. I'm just a fangirl. I want to show their beautiful faces.
I love that. I love that. And pursuant to that, would you say, or have you observed any changes in the way that Tolkien artwork is being produced these days? Like, because you've been illustrating for such a long time now, in terms of fans who are have a stronger preference for doing landscapes, or do you see that more people are depicting characters now, like more specifically, as you were saying, like appearances? Have you seen any interesting changes or trends with Tolkien artwork?
It's quite an interesting gender divide.
Oh, okay.
Because if you look into it, and of course there are exceptions, but generally the male artists seem to be more interested in the landscapes, and the female artists seem to be very interested in the characters. And that is something that you can really see with a lot of favorite Tolkien illustrators. Whether it's the three official ones, Ted Naismith and John Howe and Alan Lee, of course, who always focus very much on the surroundings, which is also apparently, as far as I know, an official guideline not to prescribe too much of the characters' faces, which again I can understand in fiction written for adults, not to prescribe too much. But most of the female artists that I know are fan artists in the classical sense. So they are fans, and they love to illustrate these works, and they work very often for the fans, and so it's very, very often a huge amount of faces and characters that they do.
That is really, really interesting. I'm curious to see whether this will change at all in the future as more people get introduced to Tolkien's work.
Yeah, I'm not sure it will. I think it is a bit of a biological thing as well. I just think that the more or less female mind has a slightly greater interest in faces. And I couldn't quote any sources now, but I've read several articles and books on the matter, and that seems to be backed by biology and the brain structure. And the more or less male mind has more interest in spatial things like the bigger picture and the landscapes and the surroundings and everything. Architecture, Minas Tirith.
Right. That's really
mountains.
True.
Big things.
That's really fascinating.
Again, obviously there are exceptions, and that doesn't mean that male artists don't do characters, and that doesn't mean that female artists don't do the surroundings. But I do see a general tendency to that ends.
That is a very interesting observation. So, well then, next question.
It's not mine.
It's not. Well, it is kind of yours as well. It's interesting because, like, I guess as you say, like when we're talking about the main artists in the Tolkien community, it is cool to observe it within your own setting, I guess.
Yeah. It was brought up in a Tolkien conference in 2012.
Oh, was it?
When I was on the illustrators panel together with Ted Naismith, Anke Eisman, Ruth Lacon, and Jay Johnston. So that was and one of the observations that was brought up there, and I thought that was very interesting because as we had a couple of female fan artists as well as the official Ted Naismith. And everybody can see that he is very much into these grand things like the big mountains and the fortresses and the lakes and the places. Yeah.
So interesting. Wow. So, well then, my next question for you is, with all of this, would you ever recommend Tolkien's work to others, and why or why not?
I constantly do. Yeah, so I introduced my own children to Tolkien at a very early age, even younger than I was, because I just couldn't wait. So I told The Hobbit to them as a sort of goodnight story, a bedtime story. And like my mother, I read some bits and left out some bits. We've been periodically rereading it. We started reading The Lord of the Rings, but unfortunately, none of my children was ever that much into it, so we never really did the full-on book reading experience with them that I had. But there have been several occasions on which I told pretty much the entire Silmarillion to my daughter.
Oh, really?
Usually when I'm painting, she comes in, looks at what I'm doing, and asks, "Who's that again?" And of course, I can't just say it's Fingolfin because I have to start at the beginning. So she gets the beginning and she gets everything. And I bring up my paintings to illustrate things. And yeah, that's always a very fun experience. Usually takes about 3 hours.
I love that. It's very, very relatable.
Yeah.
There's no short explanation.
Absolutely no.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm curious. Just before we began this interview, we were talking a little bit about some of the new artistic tools that you're using these days for your Tolkien artwork as well as for other artwork. I'm just curious if you can share with our listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. I've always been very open to all sorts of media. I don't think there's a lot that I haven't tried. From Lionel cutting, which wasn't really my cup of tea, And so, of course, obviously there's pencil, there's always been a watercolor. I've dabbled a bit with colored pencil, with pastels, and I tried oil painting, but it's really too much bother for me, so I never really got into that. And so right now I'm trying out gouache again. Then there's always been digital media as well, so Photoshop, Painter back in the day, and now, of course, on the iPad with Procreate. So that's a lot of great things to explore all the time.
Oh, that's really wonderful. So, are you currently working on any projects or artworks related to Tolkien? Anything we can look out for?
I'm constantly working on artwork related to Tolkien. Not really projects so much. I'm very happy to just keep it small and simple. So right now, with school being an absolute nightmare due to lockdown and remote teaching and in-person teaching and hybrid teaching, and nobody really knows what's going on and how the next month is going to look. So I'm trying to keep my art time very simple and very much interest driven. So when I feel like painting something adorable, I will paint Finrod with a dormouse, baby Finrod with a dormouse. So that was my Elflings and Critters series. So that was Finrod with a dormouse. Then came Legolas with a squirrel. And then, of course, Mythos with a baby fox. So I really let out all my harmony wishes during this absolutely nightmarish time in that series. And I do want to do a Fingon. I started to do a Luthien, a young Luthien with little nightingales, but that never saw the light of day. So maybe I will revisit that. I'm currently doing these tiny little card arts that I started doing this month, and I'm sure there will be more of that as well. And I'm getting back into gouache, so opaque media as opposed to these translucent watercolors. So I've got a sketch of Mythros, of course, that I'm working on right now, and that will get the gouache treatment hopefully this weekend.
That's very exciting.
It is.
100%, yeah. That's great. That's great. So, Jenny, thank you so much for doing this interview with us. Where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Yeah, I'm pretty much all over the place, I'm afraid. So you can find me on Instagram, for example, Jenny Dolfen Art. You can find me on Twitter. I forget if it's Jenny Dolfen or Jenny Dolfen Art. One of those will work. And I'm on Facebook with the Facebook page, The Art of Jenny Dolfen. So that switched. And my own homepage is really getting a bit neglected of late. Because with lockdown and everything, I always feel that it has to be something really worthwhile and not just these hodgepodge drawings that I keep turning out. So, so my website is not really that representative of my work at the moment. So I think Instagram is it's a place where you see everything in one place and get the best picture of what I'm currently into.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much once more for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And it was great to talk to you.
It was, yes. Thank you.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @Luke B. Shelton.
I'm @SR Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.